Hi everyone, welcome to Lecture 6. This week we're continuing our discussion about potential barriers to partnerships. We're focusing this week on the idea of children and families with children who have special needs, or it could be parents with special needs as well. And we're looking at abuse and trauma. So as I warned last week, this week we are discussing abuse from the point of view of physical, emotional and sexual abuse, as well as neglect. So please be aware it'll be the second half of the lecture if you want to scan through some things. So you can have a look at the notes and that will give you enough information. There's also a huge amount of way too much information available online. It is a little bit scary when you start to investigate it. So let's have a look at this idea of potential barriers. When we have children and families with special needs in our centres or our schools, we have to be so conscious that we do not allow that to become a barrier or a reason why people don't come in and so on. Abuse and trauma also creates massive barriers. So what we need to do is work out how do we ensure that those circumstances don't interfere with our engagement with families, because we want to make sure that we're not just educating the child, but we're creating that wonderful synergy and partnership with all of the caregivers who are involved with that child as well. I love this whole concept of it takes a whole village to raise a child. I know for me as a parent who has special needs children, that when my children were little and they were going through their horrible time of early years, which is when all of the things, their problems, we hadn't gone through formal diagnosis, all of those sorts of things. If I didn't have a strong support network, and I was lucky I had an incredibly strong support network, I can't imagine a single mother without strong family connections being able to deal with the issues that I had to deal with. So that's why I feel so much for parents who are going through that process of a diagnosis, or we'll have a look in a few more slides where they don't want to go through the process of getting a diagnosis. It does take a whole village to raise a child, but our world that we are in at the moment, it actually makes it really tricky to find your village. I was lucky. I have a really incredible husband. I had my beautiful mum and dad who stepped in at the drop of a hat to do anything that needed to be done. And really importantly, I had my children's godparents, both of them with strong families, and they stepped in as well when I needed a little bit more support and things like that. So I knew that I had not just one or two people, but I had different people that I could turn to help me. And I always say that particularly with Nick's godparents, that we raised him together. So they looked after him and they were his caregivers while I was working, and we did that from the time that Nick essentially was born. So his godparents were not his godparents at that point, but they became his godparents. They were the people who looked after Josh as a family daycare. And so then we have this amazing relationship. And this weekend, their son has lived with us for a while as well when they went over and lived in Sydney. So we have raised our children together. And so this weekend I am celebrating their son's wedding, the one that lived with us. So I am in the midst of doing all of that. I'll show you some photos next week. No doubt I will have some lovely photos for it. So let's have a look at this idea of children with special needs in our early years. Now, lots of children with disabilities in years gone by, they were hidden away in special schools that were designed to meet their needs. Now we have most children are mainstreamed. There are pros and cons to mainstreaming children. It depends on the needs. It depends on the school and the way that that mainstreaming is done. It is so fabulous for children to see everyone that there is in our world and not just to see people who are just like them. However, it does come with understanding and tolerance being required on all parties. Now, what we know is that funding is offered for children with special needs, and if they have a diagnosed speech or language disorder, a developmental delay, autism spectrum, they will get some funding for it as well. But all of these don't necessarily mean that you will have a full-time EA in your room. So when you go into your prac classrooms, last year for most of you it would have been in a standard classroom. This year for most of you are going into an early childhood centre, and it's very different, the funding that is between the two areas of early care. So when we go into a school, there will be funding available for children who have a diagnosis of some sort. However, that funding could be very, very minimal. So, for example, you might get a child who has a speech or language disorder. You'll get next to no funding for them. If they are also accompanied by a developmental delay and potentially some behavior disorders, you might get a little bit more funding. A straight behavior disorder like ADHD rarely gets any funding that the school will straight away get just for that child. So just because a child has a diagnosis does not mean that they will get funding to get an EA or to get extra support or to any of those sorts of things. So don't go in thinking, oh, I've got a child who's got diagnosed with autism, I've got a child with ADHD, and I've got a child with a developmental delay. I will have a full-time EA in my year one room. No, because the funding that the children receive from the government, or the funding the school receives for the children, is minimal. So a fully funded child doesn't mean that they get an EA. It means that they get about $20,000 per annum. That doesn't pay an EA's salary for the whole time. So what you'll find is that schools will be creative in the way that they assign EAs, and they will help and guide as much as possible. So I was talking with a principal last week, and he has a year 6 class that is tricky. And so he said when he first started at the school a couple of years ago that he knew that it was going to be a better allocation of funds in that particular year level to have a full-time EA, even though it was in an upper primary classroom. So when that class was in year 4, that's when he assigned an EA to them to make sure that the teachers in those classes that had that group of children were going to be adequately supported and be able to divide and conquer, so to speak, with the way that they could handle the children and so on. So that's because he knew what the teachers needed and the best things for the educational needs of the children. What we need to understand as our early years educators is that we may have children, particularly say in pre-kindy and kindy, who are yet to go through any type of diagnosis, and you will be the first person that will start talking to the parents about some of these issues. So some children will come in and you'll go, oh my word, we need to look at what's going on here. And sometimes it takes a number of years for that diagnosis to happen. Sometimes because you're not sure what it is, and sometimes because parents are not able to go through the process, and we'll talk about those reasons why in a minute. So what we need to think about is how we provide the best experience for children. What we know is that locking them up in a special school doesn't help for most children, but sometimes having special programs for certain individuals does help. Inclusion is something that we know is best for our society. It means that it involves the child in the regular classroom, and it means that the child feels included. It doesn't mean one EA sits with the child at the back of the room at a desk and the child is literally in the same physical space as the children but not doing any of the same activities and so on. So please remember that inclusion's based on 3 key principles. 1, normalization, which means that you are wanting the children to be with the other children authentically. Number 2, it's based on equality, meaning that you are making sure you are giving them equal access, sitting them at a desk with an EA at the back of the room, running a separate program. That is not equality. It's not equity, and it's not equality. And the third key thing for inclusion is that you are respecting the dignity of the individual. So please make sure that you question things when they are not being visibly equal or normalized. So we want to make sure that the child feels included. I have done prac supervision, for example, and I have been in classrooms because as a prac supervisor, you have that unique opportunity of sitting and watching for an hour or two a class, the way the children interact with one another, the way the educators in the classroom interact. Yes, of course, I'm watching the prac student, but I'm also looking at all of the other things that are going on as well. And I've seen some really, really sad circumstances of supposed inclusion that is nowhere near being inclusive. So please think and ask valid, authentic questions next year if you are told that is the process that happens with that child. There are always better strategies that can happen. So if you put a special needs child into a regular classroom without any adaptations to suit their needs, that is not inclusion. That is just pretending and ticking a box somewhere along the line. You need to make sure that good, authentic strategies are put in place. So, meaning you have an early intervention program, meaning that you are in constant conversations with the specialists who are guiding that particular child's other needs that they may have. You're making sure that you are providing the best experience for the child where possible, and that you are talking with the learned others who are able to guide you in the different things that you might need to do. Look up the technology that you can use, find the adaptive tools, find the different things that allow them to sit, stand, move, hold, do all the things if they have physical impairments of some sort. Make sure that you are being the advocate for that child. Make sure that the parents are not tearing their hair out because you're not providing for their child. Make sure that you are not whinging to your leadership team because that child shouldn't be in your classroom. The child will be in your classroom. It's up to you to be able to provide those three key principles of normalization, equity, and respect for the dignity of the individual. Seek help when you need help, because we need to make sure that we're providing the best education for all the children in our classes. And sometimes I will say that being in a regular classroom is sometimes not the best thing for every child all day. I've seen some beautiful ones where the children are in a varying centre for the morning and then they come in for the afternoon because their educational needs are so complex. So make sure that you are the true advocate for the child, not to get rid of them from your classroom, because you will have lots of children with variety of special needs. It's rare that you'll go into a class that you can't just sit there and list off, oh, and we have this children with this diagnosis and this children with this diagnosis and this one and this one. And it's always fun and games to see then how that plays out with each child and the way they interact. So what's our key ingredients of inclusion? We want to make sure that we have strong leadership from you and your leadership in your school as well. We want to be able to see clear policies that actually support inclusion. As I've said, I've seen some terrible versions of inclusion that are not inclusive at all. You want to make sure that we are developing positive attitudes from all of the teaching staff, all of your community, but also from your children the other children in your class as well, because that's what will help the child feel included. We want to make sure that all staff are working collaboratively, not just negatively sharing information, but actually going, okay, and developing a real casework approach to it. I've seen some beautiful ones where we know that a child has great difficulty. They're in year one, they have really, really struggled to understand how to play in the outdoor play area. When they were in pre-primary, it wasn't as much of an issue because they were able to work in the kind of gates of the pre-primary. When they moved to year one, being in the entire big playground was quite an issue. Nominating some poor child to be their buddy for the day, that's not going to help sometimes because they don't know how to work with a buddy. But actually working collaboratively and having a case meeting about it with people who are on duty, with potentially the other learned specialists of some sort, working out, right, what are the ways that we can put in place some effective strategies that actually do create true inclusion. Now, developing support networks amongst your staff and linking them up with different agencies. So if you know that you are the next year going to be getting the child with autism who is non-verbal, needs toileting, and so on, then you and your EA for that following year, you need to work with the outside agencies, and you might go off to professional learning of some sort so that you can work out how are you going to do it. Adequate resourcing is a key ingredient to inclusion. Being open and honest about the things that are going to be available to you between your leadership team, yourself, and the caregivers is really important. So not pretending that you're going to be able to do all these things and spend all this money and have all this stuff available. I think sometimes just saying to the caregivers, this is what we can do at school. This is what we're going to be putting in place, and so on. Sometimes caregivers don't quite understand that we're not an endless bucket of money, and that because their child has a diagnosis, sometimes they think that these things will be able to just happen as well. Whenever there is training or professional learning events that are available, make sure that you put your hand up for them, and that applies even when you're on your final school experience as well. So when you find out a little bit more about your class, do a bit more reading, see if there's any professional learning that you can go to, find out if the school has anything happening even next term, and so on, that you can start to find out more to better create the best environment even while you're on prac. You need to always be a close liaison with the parents because that's how we get authentic inclusion happening. And we look at how we can adapt our curriculum and our teaching strategies and ways that we are communicating to ensure that the needs of all the children in your class are being met. So let's look at some of our particular things that we need to consider that sit off to the side a little bit. Gifted children are always a really interesting group that you will have in your class. We often think of children with special needs as the deficit model. So the needs that we need to bring them up to be able to function. It's important to think of the other end as well. Some of our gifted children, and they might be comorbid with other conditions. Often you may find a gifted child is sometimes an undiagnosed child with autism. So you want to get them tested. So first step, if you are thinking about it, is have a look and see if you can get the school psych involved and have an IQ test done on the child. So IQ tests are looking for things like patterns. They're looking for early reading ability. They're looking for the way that a child processes problems and so on. So you may find that a child is gifted in lots and lots of areas, or they may just need extension because their language is extraordinarily well developed, or their mathematics ability is extraordinarily well developed. So get second opinions. There will be people on staff who are passionate about this, or you may have friends and family who are very passionate about it, or reach out to other professionals and so on. So once you go through that, though, you would have needed to talk to the caregivers and to get permission to run any type of testing for their child and so on. So always seek those second opinions. Now, when we're thinking about gifted children, we have to think, are we just going to run small modifications for them, or are we going to run entire individual programs? I've done both. So I had a year 3 boy, I think just in my second year out. He, looking back, he would definitely have been a child with autism. His ability with language was beyond belief. However, for the first couple of weeks that I had him in year 3, I actually didn't know if he could read or write because he did not do anything for me. He did no work. He would not even begin to speak to me. He was quite shut down and I didn't know what was going on. And then we started a writing program. And so we were actually just starting doing narratives and so on. Yeah. So then he wrote me an entire science fiction mini novel in year 3. And that was when I went, oh, wow, okay. And he did it in class and then continued at home and then came back and did more. So I knew that it wasn't parents doing it for him. He literally wrote a mini novel in year 3. I couldn't believe the amazing content that he had, particularly given a couple of weeks earlier, I wasn't sure if he could spell. I wasn't sure if he could write. So gifted children may not present to you gifted in all areas. So we need to be the person who is carefully observing and looking at things. Now, with children who are gifted, one of the issues that you will often have is their social development. And again, as I said, a lot of gifted children, they are now realizing in later life that they were not just gifted, they actually had autism. And that social development is a tricky little beast. When a child is significantly different from the other children, or even a little bit different, children can sometimes exclude them, sometimes deliberately and sometimes inadvertently. And sometimes I did have a child in year 6 who was she just sat in a different league to all the other children. And she was very, very, very bright in all areas. She had an extraordinary way of seeing the world. She was a voracious reader. She just really loved to explore language and new ideas and just went off and researched, and she made choices to not sit with anyone at lunchtime and recess time. And I spoke with her at length about it, and she said, I have nothing in common with any of the people that I am at school with. She said, I've spoken with my mum and my dad, and maybe I'll find some friends in secondary school, but maybe it might take me until university to find some really good friends. At the moment, none of these people are people that I want to be friends with. She had made that choice. As I'm saying it, it sounds really arrogant of her, but it was more just she had done a reflection and went, it's too hard for me to try and make friends. She made a choice not to make friends at that point in time. She had tried a few years earlier when she was a bit younger and she really wanted to be friends with people, but she was too different from them. She just didn't like the same things they liked and so on. So find out, does the child want to have friends? It was eye-opening for me with this particular girl. So if they do, help them. There are some great different professional learning events on social skills, so you can work out ways that you can help them in the best way possible. This is one that I have had a lot, particularly for those people who don't have social development issues. You will often find gifted children trying to just fit in with everyone else. They do not want to go to a special program. They do not want special work. They do not want you to do anything else. They just want to be like everyone else in the class. So just watch out for that. Don't build a whole program around them when they don't want to do it. So talk to the child about it. Often a gifted child will be very articulate and they will be able to tell you what they need. So when we're thinking about how we support a child, we want to make sure that we are providing good systems for them. We want to make sure that we are working out, do we need to provide support for them in just one area, or is it going to be multifaceted support? Do we need to seek special second opinions, different advocates, and so on? We have to be aware of how to develop their social development as well as other types of development. We want to be very organized so we can take clear notes, explain what the problem is, be able to address it with the caregivers, be able to address it with the other people like psychologists or speech therapists that may be coming into the room, or physical therapists, any of those other caregivers and specialists who are coming in to work with them. Now, sometimes what you will have happen as you start to talk to a child, you go, oh, okay, yes, there's something definitely that we need to investigate further. And then you start to talk to the parents. And what starts to happen is you're like, okay, the parents don't want to go through anything else. All right, then. So when a child is diagnosed at birth, so for example, a child is born and they're diagnosed within a few weeks of birth of a particular issue, parents have time to process that information. And then they start going through the support networks and so on. When a child comes into kindergarten and you're going, there's something not quite right, it will be a process that a parent or caregivers have to go through. And they will go through denial, very much so. They may project it on you and the school and say, well, you should be doing these things. They could be really scared because they know that financially, emotionally, and so on, it could incur a cost on them. They will go through potentially a part of guilt that they've done something wrong, because sometimes different special needs may be a result of different things that have gone on in the home. They will go through a mourning or a grief process where they are thinking of what could have been but will not now happen. They may withdraw from you and not darken your door again because they do not want to hear anything else. They could go through an anger and rejection part about things that you are saying, and they do not want to know what is going on. Or they could just accept it and they want your help in some way. So the way that you deal with the parent will depend on the way they reflect that back to you. So going in very supportive with lots of open lines of communication, really try and understand the stress that that parent may be feeling at home. So when you call a parent in and you start with, I just want to talk to you about Johnny's behaviour at school, that is going to immediately put the back up of the parents. Go in with, Johnny is such a lovely student. He's doing this, he's doing this. He's such a bright little bubbly one. Then you can start to talk to them about how sometimes his over-enthusiasm is creating issues and so on. So think what you want to have reflected back to you is what you need to say and do when you're trying to have those difficult conversations. And sometimes you will have those conversations over and over again and nothing will happen, and you would be part of just putting the notes in for the next teacher the following year as part of handover because you haven't been able to get success in the first part. So with chatting with the parents and getting things happening, we then move into this idea of early intervention. So as I said, sometimes when they start at kindergarten, that's when you will notice that a child may need some intervention of some sort. So therefore you need to chat with the parents, you'll need to chat with the people in your school. You may get diagnosis or detection of things. You might get the school psych involved. You may get the parents to take them to a pediatrician. Just remember, we've talked about this previously, that getting specialist appointments at the moment is very hard and very expensive. So look at what you can access via the school that just requires permission from the parents. And be prepared for the parents to be a little bit defensive about some things. So always seek advice from more experienced teachers. Have all your information lined up prior to having a meeting with the parents, and be prepared to have to do multiple follow-ups in some way, all right? Because sometimes it's a hard process to go through. So they're going to need emotional support. Keep them involved in the decision-making processes. Make sure that you give them written information where possible, not just verbal, because as you're talking to them, they may be not processing what you say because it's a bit scary. And try to reach some common goals within some good deadlines and really work as a team. So convince them that you're dedicated to helping their child. So work out their IEP with them. So yes, of course you may have things that you want them to work on, but work it with the parents. And for IEPs, the teachers and the parents and other professionals, you all work together to discuss the progress, the current concerns, and then work out your new goals. That should be done every single term. You don't have an IEP that goes for the whole year and never gets addressed again. An IEP needs to be regularly updated and changed. And I find sometimes I see student IEPs that are very global. Absolutely, you need to have a couple of big global goals, but make lots of specifics that you can feel the child is actually meeting and that you can talk about how they're achieving those in some way. So how can they help at home? Keeping them in clear communication. So explaining things you're doing in class and things that they might be able to do at home. It might be sending them home some flashcards or other resources. It might be sending home information about the program that you're using, not just the program itself, but about it, why, and so on. You've then got the broader community. The parents in that community are very vulnerable. I've had instances and heard of instances in schools where one particular child in a school has been ostracized because, yes, they are a very aggressive child, but the parent community has decided that they're going to complain multiple times, multiple parents about that. And they're complaining to the class teacher, they're complaining to other parents, they're complaining to the school admin, but they're not looking at how they can support one another. So help to educate the community about what and why is going on with the support of the parents of the actual child themselves and so on. Parents feel very vulnerable when their child is the one doing the wrong thing and they know their child is not coping, they know things are going on, they don't know what to do. So support them and help others to understand what's going on. So next thing to think about is where you can go to for help. There's a variety of different places that parents will be able to go to for help. Guide them in some way for them. Things to think about are siblings of children with special needs. Now, at a school that I worked at, we had twins, and one of the twins had cerebral palsy from birth, and over the course of the few years that they'd been at the school, the twin who had cerebral palsy ended up being in a wheelchair, and their physical needs were really becoming more intense. The other child had minimal concerns. And so it was really amplified with it being twins, that one twin was able to be in the classroom without any actual extra intervention needed, whereas the other twin needed a huge amount of intervention. And it meant that mum needed to devote a lot more time to the twin who needed extra support needs. So siblings can feel very isolated, and that was certainly the case with our other little one. And then his behaviour started to arc up by the time he got to middle primary, because he literally was crying out for attention in some way. And so it was a little bit sad to see. So help parents to understand that, and make sure in a classroom that you are providing lots and lots of support as well. So looking at it from a positive point of view, gosh, they have such an insight into what is going on, and they are so mature about dealing with the special need of their sibling. And they have such pride usually and such great loyalty. There's different programs. So oftentimes you will have communities that have been set up because of particular identified disorders or disabilities. So the siblings will have programs available to them where they can meet up with others in exactly the same situation. So if we look at this, what are you going to do to ensure that you work in partnership? Reach out first, have lots and lots of ongoing communication with them. Make sure that you are valuing the voice of the family. Make sure that you have ensured accessibility to the room, that you're flexible, and you are seeking information and understanding. So think about your role when you're dealing with the partnerships with children and families with special needs. Now, moving on to our next topic, which is such a growing one now. So, trauma. Trauma, by definition, is a threat to life or limb, severe physical harm or injury, including sexual assault, receipt of intentional injury or harm, exposure to the grotesque, violent sudden loss of a loved one, witnessing or learning violence, and learning of exposure to a noxious agent and causing death or severe harm to another. So for young children, traumatic stress, it impacts every facet of their lives. It impacts their ability to learn, to function in our social environments, to manage their emotions. Becoming a trauma-informed educator means that we have to become really aware of how it alters the lens by which they see their world. And it often can be quite different to the way we see the world. So how does it impact children? It is toxic and it affects their learning and development in lots of different ways. What it triggers all the time is the fight, flight, or freeze, which is why children who are exposed to trauma will often come out fighting. And they're the ones that if you back them into a corner, be prepared for what's going to happen to you. And that it is their way that they have had to battle their whole lives. They might be aggressive. They will throw things. It'll look like things that we would see as being disruptive. They may pinch other children. They may slap. They do things that we just go, whoa. When you're in survival mode, you can't learn. You can't process things on a calm and logical way. You go and revert right back down and you are in fight, flight, or freeze. So we know what fight looks like. Flight means you take off. So you are put in a situation that you don't like, that you don't understand, that you feel threatened by, and you do a runner. And when you are 5, that runner is straight out the door and down the road, and you are not looking for anything else. Freeze is one that often goes hidden because the children will just be very silent and sit at their desk and they don't appear to be disruptive. They don't appear to have any problems, but they're not learning. Nothing is going in. And so when you are then asking them to do something, they don't know what to do. They don't know how to answer. And so then they might give you a fight or a flight. So most teachers are becoming more and more aware of the effect of trauma. And I'm finding there is finally lots of professional learning that is coming out, but it's still not enough to meet the needs of some of the trauma and what we now know about the effect of trauma. So what are our best practices for the classroom? First of all, know the signs. So according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, children experiencing trauma stress, they'll have difficulty self-regulating their emotions. They could be aggressive, skittish, impulsive, or require extra attention while simultaneously remaining fearful of new or unfamiliar situations. So what we're going to notice is those psychological symptoms. We're going to see potentially things like appetite, weight changes, really, really tired. They might be ill quite frequently. They might have poor hygiene. So when they're sudden, that's an issue because they could be experiencing that traumatic life event at that point in time. But when we see them consistently, that's where things are going wrong at home or somewhere else. So children who experience trauma, they're going to feel triggered by a lack of clear structures and routines. So you want to make sure that you are present and emotionally available for that child. You want to make sure that you are providing that consistency and structure. So just making sure that you have good classroom systems, gentle voices, making sure that you are thinking, how are you going to handle these situations? Putting yourself out there to receive and be part of social emotional training. So get serious about it. Don't just read a couple of articles and so on. Children who are severely traumatized, they will require amazing support that you need to be emotionally ready to give them. They need explicit emotional training to regulate their emotions, process the stress, and of course heal from whatever the experience is. Ideally, they would be receiving counselling, but we know that might not happen. But thinking things that you can build into your classroom routines, like meditation, breathing exercises, all of those amazing mindfulness practices, they will all help for the child to have social emotional training. So using restorative practices over zero tolerance. So this is where we might talk about the equity versus equality. So generally, we wouldn't tolerate any type of physical harm to another child. However, if a child has made a particular child feel very unsafe, that child who's going through trauma only has one reaction, which is a physical reaction. So helping them to understand that they need to say sorry, that they need to then make it up to the other child, is much better for them than just suspending them. Sometimes we'll need to remove them from the classroom so they can calm down, but then teaching them how to do restorative practices is really important, because otherwise you will just get into negative cycles in your room that you will never be able to overcome. And as adults, we can't psychoanalyze the children. We need to look at what's happening. We need to look at why, but then we need to seek help and be really mindful of the impact on you. Having a child who's going through massive trauma is really, really draining on an educator. So look at your support mechanisms as well. So think about what you need to work effectively with that student. So we know a healthy teacher is a more effective teacher. So look at what you can put in place for yourself. So we know that abuse of all forms is a form of trauma. So if we look at our definitions, physical or mental injury, sexual abuse, negligent treatment or maltreatment of a child under the age of 18 by a person, that is termed abuse. Child abuse is anything in which an individual's institutions or processes do or fail to do which directly or indirectly harms children, and maltreatment is when they've been subjected to sexual, emotional, or physical actions or interactions that result in harm or injury. So what is our forms of abuse? The ones that you will see, you'll see physical abuse. We know what that looks like. All right. It will be scattered all over their body. There'll be clusters of bruises in certain areas. There'll be things that you're like, okay, that's not just from falling over. We're used to seeing bruised knees, elbows, bumps on the forehead where they fall over and so on. We shouldn't see in most children arm holds on the tops of their arms. We shouldn't see finger marks on the tops of their arms. We shouldn't see large bruises around their torso. That means that they are potentially being hit. So physical abuse, look for it. Emotional abuse, that is harder to pick up on because it will be the way the child reacts to certain instances that will give you a trigger for it. And different stages of their development, children will show you that in different ways. You'll witness it sometimes though. You'll hear things and you're like, oh my word, okay. Sexual abuse in an early years setting, it's sometimes difficult to see. If you notice something that is that you think is an indicator for sexual abuse, follow up on it. You must. We are mandatory reporters, so if you notice something, you need to then be extra vigilant about it, because sexual abuse is difficult to see, but it is visible if you know what you are looking for. Now, neglect, on the other hand, we will see. And neglect will be things like they don't come with lunch, they've got dirty clothes, they're picked up late, they're essentially just neglected in their basic needs. So for our physical abuse, we've got our regular bruising, scalds, welts, rashes, things that they're reluctant to tell you. You know, if a child comes in and goes, oh my goodness, I fell off my skateboard yesterday, look at the bruise that I got. And you're like, oh, wow. But if you have a bruise on if you notice a bruise on a child and they're like, I don't know how I did that, I don't want to talk about it, and so on. If they're a bit disruptive, spaced out, they don't like to be touched, and so on, they are all symptoms of abuse. Our sexual abuse, you will see one or all of these types of things. Now, the one that you will often see in our early years is that you will see this idea of sexual activities with toys. A 4-year-old shouldn't be acting out sex acts. It's as simple as that. If they are using different words for private body parts, you're like, okay. Oftentimes they will be small for their age with no other reason, because what we know is that their body is frantically trying to make up for everything else that is going on in their world. So in our Maslow's hierarchy, they need safety and security first. They need those necessities before they can learn. So a student who is going through issues of sexual abuse, you will see a decline in school performance. And this can be at any age. You will see poor self-esteem, which might be shown in other versions of things. Some myths. Children, young children particularly, they will not make up stories about being sexually abused. They don't make it up for attention. If they tell you something, they're telling you for a reason. They will tell someone. There's often things that adults will say, oh, if they didn't like it, they would tell someone. A child doesn't know it's wrong. They know they're feeling wrong, but they're being coerced. They're being told things. They're not going to say stop when they're 5. Children are never to blame for sexual abuse. So these are myths. A child will not know if a child was being abused. Sometimes that is so damaging when parents hear that. And it's scary, because if it's happening under their nose, they feel incredibly guilty. So we can't turn it on to the mothers and say, oh, well, you should know if your child was being abused. And it's not the mother's fault if the child is being abused. This is the worst one. Children are most likely to be sexually maltreated by strangers. They're not. 90% plus of sexual abuse is from people in their immediate family and circle of friends. So it is not strangers who are hurting children. They are the ones we hear on the news. The times that it is happening is usually with friends and family. Their older brother's friend was one that came out in the news lately. A child was abused with so many circumstances. And a myth, it's better not to report abuse to the authorities as it's more traumatic. No, it's mandatory reporting. So emotional neglect, we will see mood swings, low self-esteem, we'll see acting out, we'll see a change in weight, either larger or smaller. We'll see physical signs for emotional and neglect abuse, and we'll see low performance on lots of things. In terms of our family characteristics, we will see the models that parents themselves have had, the skills they've gained. So parents who come from families that have been dysfunctional will often know only those, and they're not sure what to do. We will have potentially some high levels of stress from children within environments of poverty and so on. Very young parents will often find that they are not able to take really good care. Not all the time, but sometimes. And those characteristics, they're not always a higher risk, but sometimes they are related to it. So what do we need to do? We need to seek advice, we need to observe, we need to make records. When we're making records, your records become pieces of evidence. Make sure that you are recording dates, times, circumstance. Facts, not emotions or analytics. You're recording potentially photos of harm. You're writing descriptions of the changes of the normal behaviour, and they're writing down anything that has come out about the family. And you're making sure any cultural characteristics of the family are recorded where necessary, and anything that the child has told you that could raise suspicions. So what do we do for support services? You look for Lifeline, Family Children Services, and so on. So there are a variety of different services. Now, this next one, it is mandatory to report any instances where you have had a disclosure of sexual abuse. So even if you are on prac, you go and speak to your mentor teacher, who then goes and speak to your leadership. You can't use any of those myths and go, oh, it's okay, they're just making it up. No. You have to report it. So make sure that you become familiar with the mandatory reporting. I've actually found some schools have made people do it even before they go on prac. Understand the Safe Schools framework. It's a government initiative. It's designed to keep all of our children safe. And then, what are you going to do in terms of partnerships? Are you going to make sure that you listen, you engage? Don't ask too many questions because people run away. I've had that happen where they literally left the school. Keep the conversations to the child, not to the other people in the family and so on. Refer to services in your community, use your resources and your colleagues for advice. So in our tutorial this week, we're looking at in more detail the idea of abuse and trauma and mandatory reporting. We're exploring that idea of what and when we have to report. And then I want to have a little bit of time to discuss our second assignment, because we have some people who have theirs becoming due in week 7. So in week 7, we're looking at school and home-based programs. We're looking at technology and how that can help. And we've got the first of our presentations that are happening. So thank you everyone, and I will see you all in class or online.